In December 1944, the Second World War was approaching its final stage. The Allied forces had liberated France, crossed into Belgium, and were preparing to invade Germany itself. Many soldiers believed the war in Europe would be over soon, perhaps even before Christmas. The front lines were stretched thin, and the Americans had positioned some of their divisions in what was considered a quiet sector, the Ardennes forest in Belgium. It was cold, heavily wooded, and far from any major German force. It seemed like the perfect place to rest. But Adolf Hitler had other plans. Refusing to accept defeat, he conceived one last gamble, a massive counterattack that could change the course of the war. His idea was to split the Allied armies in two, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and surround the British and American forces in northern Europe. The operation was to be fast, brutal, and decisive. If it succeeded, it might even force the Allies to negotiate peace, allowing Hitler to turn his attention back to the Soviet Union in the east. This plan would become known as the Ardennes Offensive, but the world would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States during World War II. At dawn on December 16, 1944, the stillness of the forest was shattered. More than 200,000 German soldiers, supported by 1,000 tanks and heavy artillery, struck the American lines without warning. The attack spread across a 70-mile front. Entire divisions were caught off guard. In the freezing fog, communication lines were cut, radios went silent, and confusion swept through the Allied ranks. The German army advanced rapidly. Using the cover of bad weather, they pushed deep into American territory, creating a massive bulge in the Allied front line, hence the name of the battle. Villages that had been peaceful only a day earlier were suddenly under fire. Civilians fled through the snow, clutching their children and whatever belongings they could carry. In the small Belgian town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division, known as the Screaming Eagles, was sent to hold the line. These were battle-hardened paratroopers who had fought in Normandy and the Netherlands. They were led by experienced officers and young captains who had seen too much death already, but they obeyed their orders without hesitation. Bastogne was a key crossroads. If the Germans took it, they could reach the River Meuse and split the Allied armies in half. Losing it was not an option. The paratroopers arrived with little equipment, almost no winter clothing, and very limited supplies. They expected a short fight. What they faced instead was a brutal siege that would test their courage, endurance, and humanity. As the first shells began to fall around Bastogne, the town's narrow streets filled with frightened civilians. Many sought shelter in basements and churches. American medics turned school buildings into makeshift hospitals. Outside, soldiers dug trenches into the frozen ground. The temperature dropped below -10 degrees Celsius. Snow and mud mixed with blood. Yet the men worked tirelessly, knowing that every minute counted. The German advance surrounded Bastogne within days. The Americans were completely cut off. No reinforcements, no supplies, and no way out. Their only hope was to hold the town until help could arrive. Every road leading in or out was under enemy control. The paratroopers of the 101st found themselves isolated in a sea of German armor. But they were not afraid. They had been trained for impossible missions. Their commander, General Anthony McAuliffe, encouraged them to stay strong. He told them that their stand in Bastogne would be remembered, that they were the wall between Hitler and victory. The men believed him. They knew the odds were against them, yet they refused to surrender. For many, the worst enemy was not the Germans, but the cold. Frostbite spread rapidly. Ammunition froze. Guns jammed. Blankets were scarce, and fires could not be lit without revealing positions to the enemy. The men survived on what little food they had: cold rations, frozen bread, and melted snow for water. But even in such misery, their morale did not break. Among the soldiers were young Americans barely out of high school, fighting beside veterans who had been in combat since D-Day. They shared stories of home, of mothers, wives, and sweethearts waiting for them. In the middle of war, those small memories gave them strength. Meanwhile, Hitler's generals were confident. They believed Bastogne would fall within days. The German commander demanded the Americans surrender, promising fair treatment for the prisoners. When the message reached General McAuliffe, he read it carefully, then simply replied with one word: nuts. The Germans were baffled by the slang, but the Americans laughed. That single word became a symbol of defiance. Bastogne would not yield. The first major assault began soon after. Waves of German infantry advanced through the snow, supported by tanks and artillery. The ground shook with explosions. American paratroopers fought fiercely from foxholes and ruined buildings, holding their fire until the enemy was close. The battle raged for hours, and by nightfall, the snow around Bastogne was littered with shattered helmets and silent bodies. The Americans had held their ground. Against overwhelming odds, they stopped the German advance for another day. But the siege had only begun. Their situation was desperate. Ammunition running low, wounded piling up, and no sign of relief. Still, they fought on. And so, in the frozen forests of Belgium, a handful of men stood against an army. The battle for Bastogne had begun, and the world would soon learn what true endurance looked like. By December 20th, Bastogne was completely surrounded. All roads leading in and out were cut off by German tanks. The 101st Airborne, along with a handful of tank destroyers and artillery, were now trapped. There were no supply lines, no reinforcements, and almost no hope of escape. The weather was merciless. Temperatures dropped to -20°C. Snow kept falling, covering bodies, helmets, and weapons. Soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets, gun cloth, anything they could find. Frostbite spread faster than the enemy. Despite everything, morale stayed high. The men of Bastogne believed they could hold out. Private William Turner later wrote in his journal, "We were frozen, hungry, and surrounded. But we were not broken. Not one man talked about surrender. We only talked about when the tanks would arrive." The tanks Turner meant belonged to General Patton's Third Army, fighting miles to the south. But reaching Bastogne through deep snow and enemy lines seemed impossible. Inside the town, medical tents overflowed with wounded soldiers. Supplies were nearly gone. Morphine and bandages were rationed. Many were treated with strips of torn clothing. Food was reduced to one meal a day, mostly hard biscuits and melting snow for water. Still, every night, the men repaired trenches, melted ice to clean rifles, and took turns standing guard. The silence of the forest was broken only by the distant sound of artillery. On December 22nd, a German messenger appeared under a white flag. He carried an ultimatum demanding Bastogne's surrender. The note was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, who was in temporary command of the 101st Airborne. He read it, smiled, and wrote a single word in reply: "Nuts." The messenger was confused. But when the translation reached the German commander, the message was clear: "Go to hell." That defiance lifted morale across Bastogne. Even though they were outnumbered, outgunned, and freezing, the Americans knew surrender was no longer an option. Over the next few days, the Germans launched wave after wave of attacks. Panzer tanks tried to break through the defenses. Paratroopers with bazookas and anti-tank mines fought them off at close range. Fields turned into frozen graveyards of steel and fire. One German tank broke through the southern line before being hit by an American shell at just 30 meters. The explosion echoed through the woods, and for a moment, the silence returned. In the church of Bastogne, Father Samuel Leonard prayed over the wounded. The pews were covered with straw and blood-soaked bandages. Outside, medics carried men through the snow while shells whistled overhead. Every soldier knew this was not just a battle for a town. It was a battle for survival. Meanwhile, Patton's Third Army was moving north at full speed. Tanks rolled day and night, struggling through the snow-covered roads. Engineers worked non-stop to clear paths, while fighter planes waited for the skies to open. The weather, as always, decided everything. On Christmas Eve, the skies finally cleared. The clouds broke apart, and for the first time in days, sunlight touched Bastogne. Allied planes roared overhead, dropping supplies and ammunition by parachute. For the soldiers trapped below, it felt like a miracle. That night, despite the cold, many soldiers whispered prayers. They thought about home, about family dinners, about Christmas lights they would never see again. But they also knew that holding Bastogne meant saving thousands more down the line. Because if Bastogne fell, the entire Allied front could collapse. By Christmas morning, the men of Bastogne had been surrounded for 6 days. The snow had turned red from blood and black from smoke. Every street in the town bore the marks of shellfire. Houses were torn apart, windows shattered, trees splintered. But the defenders refused to fall. Each foxhole, each ruined building became a fortress. Machine gunners fired until the barrels of their weapons glowed red. Riflemen waited in the cold for hours, their fingers stiff from frost. Yet, when the enemy appeared, they fired with deadly precision. The Germans, too, were struggling. Their fuel supplies were running low. Tanks stood idle in the forest, unable to move. The offensive that had begun with confidence was slowing down. Hitler's dream of dividing the Allied armies was fading under the brutal reality of winter. Still, the attacks did not stop. On December 25th, the Germans launched one of their heaviest assaults. Tanks pushed through the fog. Infantry followed close behind. The Americans fired everything they had: rifles, bazookas, mortars. The air was filled with thunder. Captain James Carter led his platoon on the southern edge of Bastogne. He had lost half of his men, but his voice never trembled. He shouted through the chaos, "Hold the line. Don't give them a single inch." Hours passed like seconds. When the smoke cleared, dozens of German tanks burned in the snow. The attack had failed, but the cost was unbearable. Carter's platoon was down to 9 men. Meanwhile, General Patton's Third Army continued its desperate race toward Bastogne. The roads were icy, mines scattered everywhere, but the men drove forward. Patton had promised General Eisenhower that he could turn his entire army north within 48 hours. Many thought it was impossible. Patton was determined to prove them wrong. Day and night, his tanks rolled through blizzards. Soldiers slept inside frozen vehicles, waking only when shells exploded nearby. They pushed through destroyed villages, past burned trucks and bodies frozen in the snow. By December 26th, they were close, only a few miles from the trapped division. But the final stretch was the most dangerous. German forces had set up ambushes along the road to Bastogne, determined to stop any rescue attempt. At 4 p.m., near the village of Ardennes, the lead American tanks clashed with German defenders. Artillery thundered across the hills. For 2 hours, the battle raged. Inside Bastogne, soldiers could hear the distant roar of engines and the rumble of heavy guns. They didn't know if it was friend or foe. But as night fell, a radio message came through. "The Third Army has reached Bastogne." Cheers erupted in the bunkers. Men hugged each other, laughed, cried, and shouted in disbelief. After a week of isolation, they were no longer alone. When Patton's men finally entered Bastogne, they were greeted by gaunt, frostbitten faces, but also by smiles. The defenders had held the line against overwhelming odds. General McAuliffe shook hands with the tank commander and simply said, "You're a little late, but we're glad to see you." The Battle of Bastogne was not over, but the siege had been broken. The Germans had lost their momentum. What had begun as Hitler's final gamble was turning into a disaster. The price was enormous. Tens of thousands of men lost their lives on both sides. Yet Bastogne became a symbol of unshakable courage, of American endurance in the darkest hour of the war. When the siege was finally broken, Bastogne was barely standing. The once peaceful town had turned into a field of ruins, buildings reduced to skeletons, streets littered with the wreckage of tanks and trucks, and the snow blackened by smoke. The men who had survived looked more like ghosts than soldiers. Their faces were hollow, their uniforms torn and frozen stiff. Many could hardly walk, but they stood tall because they knew what they had achieved. They had faced the full force of Hitler's army, and they had not fallen. General Patton personally arrived in Bastogne a few days later. When he stepped out of his jeep, soldiers gathered around, saluting with pride. He looked at them, at the destroyed landscape, and said quietly, "Gentlemen, you've done a hell of a job." His words spread through the town like fire. For the men of the 101st Airborne, those words meant more than any medal. Over the next days, the Germans continued small counterattacks, but their strength was gone. The weather had cleared, and Allied aircraft now ruled the skies. Columns of American bombers destroyed enemy convoys, cutting off any chance of regrouping. By mid-January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. The German army had lost more than 100,000 men, their last major offensive crushed. The Allies had suffered too, but the line had held. Europe would never see another German advance again. For the men who fought in Bastogne, victory was bittersweet. They had won, but at a terrible price. In the church that once served as a field hospital, rows of wooden coffins filled the aisles. Names were written on paper tags tied to boots. Outside, the frozen ground became a graveyard. Private William Turner wrote in his journal again, "We came here as soldiers. We leave as brothers. The snow will melt, but Bastogne will always stay frozen in our hearts." When spring came, the survivors were moved back to France for rest and recovery. Many could finally send letters home for the first time in months. Some wrote of heroism and pride. Others wrote of silence, the kind that never truly leaves. Years later, the veterans would return to Bastogne. They stood among the rebuilt streets, where children played and laughter echoed once more. They touched the cold stone of the monuments and remembered the faces of those who never came back. One of them said softly, "People ask what Bastogne was like. I tell them, it was hell. But it was our hell, and we held it." The Battle of the Bulge became the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II. It was a story of courage, endurance, and the will to fight even when there seems to be no hope left. And in the middle of that frozen hell, a small group of American soldiers proved that sometimes the greatest victories are not about land or power, but about the unbreakable spirit of men who refuse to give up. The morning of December 23, 1944, arrived cold and silent over the besieged town of Bastogne. Snow fell in slow, lazy spirals, blanketing the wrecked jeeps and frozen bodies that lined the outskirts. Inside the town, soldiers huddled near what remained of fires, small flickers against the biting wind. The smell of smoke and diesel hung in the air, mixed with the distant thunder of German artillery. For a week, the 101st Airborne had been surrounded. Food was scarce, ammunition low, and medical supplies nearly gone. Every man had learned to live with hunger and fear. Yet no one thought of surrender. The men in Bastogne weren't just holding ground. They were holding a line between chaos and freedom. Colonel McAuliffe's now famous reply of "nuts" to the German demand for surrender had spread like wildfire through the ranks. It became more than defiance. It was identity. When shells fell, men muttered it under their breath, half curse, half prayer. Out on the frozen perimeter, paratroopers crouched in foxholes half filled with icy slush. Frostbite had set in for many, their boots stiff and fingers numb. Still, they held their rifles tight, eyes fixed on the tree line where the enemy lurked. They had learned to tell the difference between the sound of tank treads and the crunch of snow under boots. That morning, Private Ellis watched the horizon from his shallow hole, his breath forming little clouds that vanished into the white. The rumble of distant engines echoed through the valley, German armor moving again. He nudged the man beside him. "They're coming," he said simply. Within minutes, the frozen stillness exploded into chaos. Mortars screamed overhead, ripping into the snow-packed earth. The ground shook as Panzer tanks pushed forward, their cannons flashing bright against the gray sky. The Americans returned fire with whatever they had left, bazookas, rifles, even captured German MG-42s. The noise was deafening. The snow turned black with smoke and blood. Men shouted through the haze, their words lost to the thunder of battle. The 501st and 506th Parachute Infantry fought shoulder to shoulder, pushing back wave after wave. Each tree line became a front line. Despite the horror, they held. For hours. For days. By nightfall, the town was barely standing. The church that once served as a field hospital now overflowed with wounded. Doctors worked in dim candlelight, using strips of uniforms for bandages. Morphine was gone. Whiskey had become the only anesthetic. The cries of pain echoed through the cold stone walls, blending with the howls of the wind outside. But then, on December 24th, Christmas Eve, the sound changed. From the southern horizon came a distant thunder, unlike the enemy's. It was steady, rolling, deeper. The soldiers lifted their heads, listening. Some dared to hope. By noon the next day, hope had a face. The 4th Armored Division of Patton's 3rd Army. They broke through the German lines and entered Bastogne, bringing food, ammo, and medics. The men who had been fighting on the edge of death finally saw the stars and stripes again. Tears froze on their cheeks before they could fall. For many, that was the first real Christmas miracle they had ever witnessed. But Bastogne was not the end. It was only the turning point. As the new year dawned, the snow began to melt, revealing the full extent of the destruction. Entire forests had been shredded into splinters. Towns had vanished under rubble. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive in the West, was collapsing. Still, the fighting raged on. North of Bastogne, near the village of Foy, the 101st launched a counterattack. The Germans had dug in deep, their snipers hidden in the upper floors of ruined houses. Advancing was slow and deadly. The men crawled through open fields under constant fire, the air alive with bullets snapping past. Private Miller, who had survived Bastogne, now found himself leading a small squad toward the village. Every few yards, they dropped to the ground as machine gun fire erupted. The snow was no longer white. It was streaked with mud and red. As they reached the outskirts, they found the bodies of civilians, families who had never escaped the fighting. An old woman lay near a broken cart, her hands clutching a small rosary. The sight hardened the men's resolve. They moved through the ruins, house by house. Grenades shattered windows, rifles barked through the smoke. In one building, they found 3 German soldiers, teenagers, terrified, their weapons trembling. The Americans hesitated. For a moment, the war seemed to pause. Then, with a nod, they took the boys prisoner. None of them wanted to kill children. By January 5th, Foy was liberated. The enemy was in retreat. But victory came at a price. More than 19,000 Americans killed, 47,000 wounded. It was the cost of stopping the last German offensive. The men who survived were exhausted shadows of themselves. Their faces hollow, eyes distant. They had seen too much, friends frozen solid in foxholes, tanks burning like torches, villages wiped off the map. Yet, when asked what kept them going, their answers were simple: each other. They fought for the man next to them, for the idea that freedom meant something, even if it cost everything. In the weeks that followed, Patton's forces pushed eastward, driving the enemy back toward the Rhine. The Allies regained control of the skies, bombing supply lines, crushing resistance. The German army, once feared across Europe, was bleeding out. By spring, the snow was gone, replaced by mud and blooming fields. The war in the West was ending. But for the men who had lived through Bastogne, peace felt strange, almost unreal. They had entered the woods as soldiers and left them as something else, witnesses to history. In April 1945, when the concentration camps were liberated, many of those same men stood among the barbed wire and ashes, silent. The horrors they saw there made the battlefields seem almost merciful. The war had been about territory, but now they understood. It had always been about humanity itself. When Germany finally surrendered on May 8th, there were no cheers in Bastogne, only quiet relief. The men who had fought there were scattered, some back home, others buried under foreign soil. But the town remained, a symbol of endurance. Today, if you walk through Bastogne, you can still see traces of that winter. Bullet scars on the old stone walls, memorials where foxholes once lay. And in the center stands a monument shaped like a star, dedicated to the 101st Airborne and the men who refused to yield. The snow still falls there every winter, and with it, the echo of their courage. Because the Battle of the Bulge was not just a fight for ground, it was a testament to willpower, brotherhood, and the human spirit's refusal to break, even when surrounded by darkness.